Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This is our league, and this is your league. From the 55-yard line on CFL America Radio and the Sports History Network.
This is a league of A's and BCs. It's green and red and gold and black and blue. This is a league with 2 official languages and many unofficial languages. It's East versus West, wheat versus iron, love versus hate. This is a league where superstars are extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. It's a league of ice, of fog, of mud and wind. And for one Sunday in November, it's the nation's glue. This is a league as diverse as a country, a league of Jacksons and Kwongs, Johnsons, Moscas, O'Shea's, and Haji Razulis. This is his league, her league, their league, and their league. It's my league, and it's your league. This is our league.
And welcome to From the 55-Yard Line here with Scott and Greg. And today we are joined by Joe Ziemba, noted football author and researcher and historian here in Chicago, who has written 2 books, When Football Was Football, A Complete History of the Chicago Cardinals, and Cadets, Cannons, and Legends, The Football History of the Morgan Park Military Academy. Joe, like myself, lives in Chicago, and Joe you wrote a great book years and years ago. Well, I would say years and years ago, but years ago, we'll go there, on the Chicago Cardinals. And wanted to have you on today because, we've got Hall of Fame week here with the NFL coming up. And as I posed at the end of our last podcast, I'm of the opinion, and I've shared this with Scott, that the Hall of Fame really should be in Chicago, the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And I pose it to you right off the bat. Do you agree with me or not? And if you do, help me present the case.
Greg and Scott, thank you. And boy, you start out with a tough one right away. So, but we enjoy that. If you look back at the history of pro football and the team started it, of course, we had what Chicagoans think is the East Coast, which is Ohio and Pennsylvania at the start of it. And then all the teams that were congregated right in the Chicago area. And there were several of them. And one would think when the Hall of Fame was started, and thank good it was started, that Chicago would have been given more of a look as possibly the host of a Hall of Fame. Not only had the Decatur Staleys, who became the Chicago Bears in 1921, but the oldest team of all, the Chicago Cardinals, my favorite, we had a team called the Chicago Tigers. And the Hammond Pros right across the state line, when Hammond is closer than a lot of suburbs are to Chicago itself. We had Rock Island. So there's all sorts of teams right in the area that might have been given a little stronger look as to, hey, Chicago with the size of it and the history of it and the teams that were part of the early NFL might have been a really a good reason to have a Hall of Fame in Chicago.
And just this, the small amount of research or the homework I've done, getting ready for this. I mean, Chicago almost had sort of an international soccer vibe in the sense that, there are cities in Europe that, where soccer teams kind of grow organically. And that kind of seems like what it was like in and around Chicago. I mean, it seems like there were just so many amateur teams that popped up.
We had the professional teams and the semi-pro teams that were organized in the Chicago Football League. And you mentioned soccer. In 1917, there was a strong bid to start a professional soccer league starting in Chicago, and even backing, I think, of Charles Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox. But getting back to football, teams were on every block, and that's where the teams got their names. When we talk about the Racine Cardinals, which was the first name of the Cardinals, that name came because their headquarters of their president, Chris O'Brien, was on Racine Avenue. So we had street names that teams used called the Westerns were on there. We had the Halsteads, and different parts of the city took the name of the streets. But there's a lot of different ethnic neighborhoods. They all seem to have their own football teams. And if you wanted to watch football, whether it be more organized, which were the professionals, so to speak, or the semi or just the Prairie League, there was plenty to choose from. So there were literally hundreds of football teams in Chicago around that time from 1900 to 1920, when the National Football League started as the American Professional Football Association.
And so the Cardinals, we'll talk about our favorite NFL team. The Cardinals started, 20 years before the NFL was even founded. Can you tell us the story of kind of how that all came to be? And, I know you and I have had this talk, and at your presentations here in the city that I've gone to and where we met originally, there's that issue of what year were the Cardinals actually founded? Can you tell us kind of that whole story?
Oh boy. Yeah. My favorite topic besides the Cardinals themselves. If you look in any history book, you'll see that the Cardinals started in 1898. The Hall of Fame lists that date, and the Cardinals themselves and their website list 1898. It's incorrect. They started in 1899. Even the name was incorrect. We were told in the existing history that it was the Morgan Athletic Club, started by owner Chris O'Brien. And Chris O'Brien at the time was a teenager, and he was just part of a group of kids who got together as the Morgan Athletic Association in 1899. And for the book that we did a few centuries ago, we were able to document the very first game. They played against a team called the Shermans on the south side of Chicago in 1899. So it was just a bunch of teenagers that got together. For some reason, the years got switched around over the years. And the next book I have coming out next year, which is the Forgotten History of the Bears and the Cardinals, we talk about how this misinformation came about, which started in the 1940s, long after Chris O'Brien was part of the team. But it was 1899 as the Morgan Athletic Association. It changed to become part of the Morgan Athletic Club in 1900. And what the athletic clubs were on the south side or the north side were places where gentlemen could get together and engage in sporting events like dancing or boxing or track and field. Some had football, but it was a place to go to get together because there wasn't much social life that they could do. And so these athletic clubs became very proud and very prosperous over the years. In fact, one of the original starters, I should say, or founders of the Cardinals was a gentleman called Frank Reagan, who became very active in politics in Chicago as a Cook County commissioner. He was also, unfortunately, the leader of the Reagan's Colts, which was affiliated with Al Capone in the 1920s. But we don't hear much about that. But he was one of the founders of the Cardinals. And then from the Morgan Athletic Club, we had the next major change in 1901. The team was called Cardinals Athletic Club or Athletic Association, I believe. So the story that's been told is that the name Cardinals came from Chris O'Brien buying uniforms from the University of Chicago and then saying, "Ooh, the color of these is not really red, it's more cardinal, so we're going to take the name Cardinal." So that unfortunately is not accurate either. And I've done, because I have no life, I've done some research on that and looked into Amos Alonzo Stagg's records at the University of Chicago, which are quite comprehensive. And there's no mention in his financials of selling any jerseys. But the jerseys that we see in photos that exist from the Athletic Club or the Cardinals and from the University of Chicago don't really match. So if they were in color, we could tell a little better, but they're all black and white. So that again, we're going to explain in this next book that the name Cardinals didn't come from the color of a uniform. It just came from the startup of an athletic club called the Cardinals Athletic Club way back when at the beginning of the 20th century.
That's, I'm sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Scott.
No, I was just, that's an interesting story about the uniforms because last 15 years, I was working in the upstate of South Carolina and covered Clemson football. So when I was kind of trying to do a crash course on their football program, supposedly their original jerseys were old used Auburn University jerseys, and Auburn was blue and orange, but supposedly it had, been faded by the sun, and that's why Clemson wore purple and orange. So hearing that story, it's like, oh, I wonder if this is like just an urban legend, that follows football around.
Yeah, and that's probably what happened. These urban legends continue to grow. They're picked up, and they started somewhere. So that's what my goal was. And actually, the first name of the Cardinals was the Cardinals Social and Athletic Club was the official name. But the stories that started in the 40s and 50s just get picked up every year. And I don't blame people, because when I'm researching and I look up and I'll try and find an original source for something, and if it's from the Cardinals and it says they started in 1898, well, yeah, I'm going to believe that. Why would they have the wrong information there? But again, I think that's why all of us who are involved in research do that sort of thing, is we want to get to the truth if necessary. And it really doesn't matter. But for me, I was happy to find out that the Cardinals, when they actually started, was 1899.
Oh, I love it when you start going down rabbit holes like that. I mean, to me, it's great because you find out stuff that you weren't even looking for, but might even be more interesting than what you were looking for.
And rabbit hole is another good term, and I find myself researching now, because when I did this first book was still by the old-fashioned microfilm. And microfilm, was great, but where do you find it, and is it accessible? And in Chicago, the Chicago History Museum is the place, as far as I'm concerned. They have, I shouldn't tell anybody because they'll find out about it. They have all these old neighborhood newspapers still on microfilm, but now you can subscribe to newspapers.com or newspaper archives. And I almost feel guilty when I'm looking at stuff, but then you start fading away. You see, I'm going to look up this person, and that leads to another story. And all of a sudden, here I am 2 hours later. I'm so far away from what I'm supposed to be writing about, because I found so much stuff when I jumped into that rabbit hole of football, and just keep going. But yeah, so sometimes, you got to pull yourself back and find out what your original objective was.
And how about, in just terms of the research process, how about with the libraries? I mean, obviously Chicago Public Library downtown, down there off of State is, huge. Did you spend time at the Chicago Public Library or any of, say, in the outlying suburban libraries like what you and I have? Was that part of your research there too?
Yeah, and the Chicago Public Library, the Washington Library, has great archives as well. And it's so well organized that you can go in online and see what they have. But for this, both pro football books, my first one and this now my third book, I relied on, I'm looking for information on high schools and neighborhoods. And they have neighborhood files there, especially for Englewood High School, where the players that joined the NFL. Another story about the high school players joining the league in 1925 for one game, and there's a big scandal, which we'll address pretty thoroughly in this next book. But the Chicago Library has, say, Cook County records and meetings of minutes going back to 20. So that was extremely helpful as well. And then the local libraries, I'm thinking, for example, Blue Island has microfilm of the local Blue Island papers that I've used. And even where I'm at in Frankfurt has some microfilm. But you look for the local libraries that might have that local paper that nobody else has. I use that a lot in my last book because it was about Chicago high schools, and you could go in there and look up games and verify games and scores that you might not be able to get elsewhere. So I do enjoy the old microfilm process, and I rejoice when I find something. I remember way back when I found out that first Cardinals game, I wanted to jump up and down, but had to be polite and observe the decorum and not scream and shout. And I said, wait, I wanted to tell someone I found the Titanic. I found when the Cardinals first started right here. And it was in the South Side Sun, a broad, what do they call it? A broad spread paper, which was probably about 3 feet high with a 4-point type that you had to read through every single line and hope they mentioned one of the football games you're looking for. So, but I behaved myself. You guys would be proud of me.
And in the research, and there's so much to cover here, so I'm gonna maybe hit and miss on some stuff because questions are popping into my head as we're talking. So, it wasn't too long ago I was driving, out here by Forest Park, driving by Proviso East or Proviso West. I can't remember. Yeah. Anyway, it's one of the Provisos, and I pointed to the football field, and my wife, and all I had was the audience was my wife, and I go, yeah, the Cardinals, the NFL Cardinals played a game there at Proviso. Now, of course, my wife really could have cared less, but it was just that, in terms of venues for that early NFL, the Cardinals, even before they even went to the NFL, there's a lot of football stadiums here in the Chicago area that are really historic. Oak Park High School being one of them, the one out at Proviso. Where the Cardinals, where did they make their home? And I know they are a South Side team. So on this, where have they called home in Chicago? I guess is kind of the general question I'm getting at.
Oh, yeah, they had a few homes, but I love that you brought up Proviso because in the early 30s, the Cardinals played a game there to dedicate the stadium. And it was a big deal with bands and cheerleaders, and the whole town turned out to see this game with the Cardinals playing. Cardinals won fairly easily. But back to your question, when they started out playing, we always hear that they played at Normal Park way back when in 1900. In fact, you'll see that on a lot of the websites that have the history. But Normal Park wasn't built till 1915. But it's confusing because there was a second more Normal Park over on 59th and Halsted, I believe, which would have been about a mile or so east of where, or half mile from Racine Avenue, where Normal Park is today. So they played there. They played on a patch of grass called the Woods on Wood Street, I believe. For a while, they didn't have any stands. They would rope off the area and pass the hat around so the players could get paid, hopefully. They did play at Comiskey Park. As we talked earlier, Comiskey before the name changes, then went back to Normal Park, played in 1959 in Soldier Field one year when it was pretty much falling apart. But that was at the end of the Cardinals' reign since they moved in March of 1960 to St. Louis. But they kept pretty much on the south side. A big controversy was in 1959 when the Cardinals wanted to move up to Dyke Stadium at Northwestern University, and prompted a lawsuit from George Hallis, who referred to some kind of agreement called the Madison Street Agreement from 1931 that the owner of the Cardinals, named Dr. David Jones at the time, and Hallis contracted that the Bears would not play south of Madison Street and the Cardinals would not play north of Madison Street. And Commissioner Burt Bell, he upheld that. And so the Cardinals were not allowed to move into the Northwestern field, and that prompted their move ultimately a couple months later to St. Louis. So that would have been one of the big changes. But they pretty much played at Comiskey Park from the late mid-20s all the way till 1958, except in 1930s, and this is a big one a lot of people don't know about, the Cardinals moved to Wrigley Field, the north side of Chicago. The south side fans couldn't believe it. But at the time, the Cardinals thought, move to Wrigley Field, maybe we'll get some of the big crowds that the Bears are getting. And crowds really weren't that big then. If they got 5,000 to 10,000, they were very happy for a pro football game. But the Cardinals moved there, and they leave in 1931, stayed through the entire decade before moving back to Comiskey Park. Never quite drew the fans. Unfortunately, they alienated their home base, who couldn't believe that their team was going up to the dreaded and sinister north side of Chicago. But that's what happened. So we had Comiskey Park and Wrigley Field and Soldier Field were the main ones, along with Normal Park, is where the Cardinals played throughout their history.
And of course, this was during. Oh no, sorry. And this is during an era too. We're talking city stadiums. Chicago, public. We have public transportation in the city now, but back then, public transportation was literally everywhere. You had trolley cars, you had trains, you had the L. And did the L all go all the way down to say 35th?
It did. Yeah, went farther. It did go into the Englewood neighborhood where the Cardinals were at 63rd Street as well.
And if memory serves me correctly, just even driving around, I mean, the L that we have now is just a shadow of its former self. There were many more branch lines back in the day, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So, back then, I mean, for a team to literally pack up and move to the other side of the city in this day and age, it's not a big deal. Teams do it all the time. But back then it was a huge deal because it wasn't easy to get from the north side to the south side. I mean, you had to make a few transfers along the way.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It was amazing that they did that, and the difficulties they had. And the one big difficulty, which made it inconvenient for fans, is because they shared Wrigley Field with the Cubs. And for example, I think it was 1935, the Cubs were in the World Series. They shared it with the Bears. And so guess who gets the worst choices for dates? And so the Cardinals often would have to spend the first several weeks season on the road until they got a chance to play maybe their first home game in November at Wrigley Field. But it was tough on the fans. They could get there if they really want to put the effort in. But then if it's November, and it seemed like that time it really got colder in Chicago a little earlier. Not that it's not cold every day of the year. We have the month of summer now, Greg. So, but the fans would have to not only take all these different ways of transfers to get there, but also sit in the cold for a while in a pretty much vacant Wrigley Field. So you didn't have many bodies there to warm it up with you.
I know I'm all over the map here, but I was curious when you were talking about the stadium issue, and then that kind of helped lead the move to St. Louis. Were there other cities that were possibilities that the Cardinals were going to move to, or was it always kind of going to be St. Louis?
I think St. Louis was actually a surprise. There had been talk earlier of Buffalo because they played some exhibition games there. Atlanta, there was in the 50s, San Francisco was mentioned. So there were several other cities. And the St. Louis thing, I think, came up as sort of a compromise when Lamar Hunt tried to buy the Cardinals, was unsuccessful, and decided, of course, to start this other league. And the NFL wanted to keep the AFL out of St. Louis. And so the talk was then to get the Cardinals or someone else to move there. And to help convince the Cardinals, they were given $500,000, big bucks in 1960. And some of the stories say that George Ellis put up a lot of that. And one of the reasons was that he no longer would be burdened by blackout TV. So if one team was at home, the other team might be on the road. You couldn't televise their games. Sometimes it got complicated as to what games could be televised. But in those very early days of Chicago television in Chicago and elsewhere, it was very important to be able to broadcast your games to your fans who couldn't make it to the game. Although I saw a good George Ellis once that said that he saw really no future in this television. Why would people sit in their living room watching a little box? And of course, I guess he's been proven wrong over the years.
I think the league's made a few bucks from TV.
Yeah, and then when you have 100 million people or so watching the Super Bowl now, maybe George is reconsidering that opinion.
Well, thinking back about it too, during that time period, obviously the blackout rules didn't change really until the last 20 years now. No. Has it been almost 20 years now in terms of sellouts and everything? There's the blackout restrictions have all but lifted. And so, talking about, going back, we'll go back before, let's go back to say the 1930s and everything. Why people have always wondered, it's like, oh, Chicago Soldier Field's always been the home of the Bears. No, it hasn't. And so my question to you is, why was Wrigley Field such an attractive venue versus Comiskey Park?
Well, the biggest thing was the price. As you may have heard, George Ellis was a little tight with the wallet. Sometimes he'd open that wallet and his dollar bills would blink in the light. George Washington would blink in the light. He hadn't opened it. But that's an old story. I apologize. But he had a great deal starting back in 1921 for bringing the team up, where there was a fee that they had to pay a flat fee for rental, but if they didn't hit a certain amount of attendee, then the percentage would go down. So it was really a good deal. He could practice there, could store stuff there. He had part of the concessions, 100% of the programs, except for a small percentage that went to the folks who actually sold the programs. And that was really their only other opportunity for income, was attendance and selling your programs and the advertising in it. So quite interesting that he ended up there, but it was attractive, I think, from a money standpoint. Plus, as we mentioned earlier, the crowds were not that big the first 40 years or so of the NFL. And so Soldier Field, which had 127,000, I think, for a Notre Dame game there once, and the annual Chicago High School Prep Bowl would traditionally draw over 100,000. So the Bears might have looked microscopic out there, even if they had their big crowds of 10,000 in Soldier Field. So yeah, it was available. It opened up, I think, 1924 or so, and the Bears didn't really move there till, I'm thinking, 1971. So it was there, but by that time, Wrigley was, I believe, the smallest NFL stadium. So it moved him to look for a bigger spot. And of course, they were getting bigger crowds, and it made it worthwhile. So I'm not sure what his contract was with Soldier Field, but it couldn't have been quite as attractive as it was with Wrigley Field.
Right. And, back then, I mean, the Soldier Field we see now, and I'm not even going to get in my comments about the way it is now, but back when we were all kids, I mean, it looked so much different. It was truly, it was on par with, say, LA Memorial Coliseum in terms of not only attendance, but just the way it looked. I mean, it was a truly classical, I mean, it was it was a Coliseum more than, and it was built I think, to try to attract the Olympics at one point, correct?
It may have been, yeah, back in the 20s, yeah.
Yeah. And so, talking about the Cardinals, the Cardinals trying to basically, when I read the Cardinals history, it always seems that they've been constantly searching for home in terms of whether it be at Normal Park, which is now a police station for those of people who don't know. But they were at Comiskey, and the crowds they drew at Comiskey were, I mean, tell me about the crowds at Comiskey. I mean, they drew, but back then they didn't play an equal home versus road schedule. Explain to us in terms of how it worked for the Cardinals. I mean, they played a lot of their games on the road.
They did a lot. And again, maybe it was unfavorable circumstances financially for them. They did draw some nice crowds in the 50s. They weren't getting what the Bears did, and their biggest crowd every year was the Chicago Bears when they visited Comiskey Park. So it just seemed that they were better off, because I've read a few times where the Cardinals could not make the guarantee for the visiting team. So if they decided they're going to go on the road, 40s or the 50s, they would get a certain amount of a guarantee, which would have been more profitable than if they had hosted a game and paid all the expenses, plus paid the visiting team, and then worried about the attendance having to be a certain amount to break even. So I think that had a lot to do with it, was the finances. And maybe about that time, was looking more seriously about moving. There had been an ownership change when Charles Bidwell passed away in April of 1947, and his wife remarried. Walter Wolfner, who was not a football person, made some controversial, if maybe questionable, decisions about the team and what they were doing. But it just does that they were looking for that home, and Comiskey Park seemed like the only alternative for them that they could possibly afford. So they went on the road a lot and got that guaranteed money.
And obviously and people who don't know, the University of Chicago had a very giant, very large football stadium.
It did, yeah.
Back in the day. And obviously that being, that's another, great institution on the South Side, the University of Chicago. For people who have never been there, it is one of the most beautiful college campuses I've ever been to. And, but back then they had, the big, large stadium for the football team. But the Cardinals used to practice there, from what I understand. They at least got to use the practice facilities there. So how long were they at the University of Chicago? Do you recall, in terms of how long Where did they practice? I guess that's the question I'm going for.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's funny because as you and I first met, I do these presentations around town, and before the COVID, I did one on Downers Grove, I think, and there's a gentleman there, 97 years old, and he recalled where they played at a park on the south side. So there were numerous parks and smaller stadiums that they would use. Normal Park, as we mentioned, was gone by 1950 and became that police station we talked about. So they did play at parks from the city of Chicago. They afterwards could practice at Comiskey Park after the baseball season, same as the Bears. And they did spend some time at the University of Chicago. I'm not sure how long they were there. University dropped football in 1938. And I'm not sure when that stadium was removed. Of course, it served during World War II as the invention of the atom was done there underneath the stands, which is a famous story about the University of Chicago football stadium. So it was various, and I think wherever the Cardinals could find a place, whether it was mostly on the south side, they would practice. And sometimes they played up at Lane Tech High School, Loyola High School. They played some preseason up there and had some practices. So it was pretty much wherever they could find that elusive home. That's where they would practice either in preseason or during the season itself.
You guys were talking about gate receipts earlier, and I was curious, during that era, was it kind of like the Wild West where whichever teams played, that they are the ones that figured out gate receipts, or did the NFL sort of have a plan of how they wanted it to work?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. One of the things that I'm addressing quite heavily in my new book are the papers from Dutch Sterneman, who was a partner in the Bears from 1920 to about 1931 or so, I should say 1921. And he kept the records for the Bears. And it shows that the home team, pretty much kept the records. And they're very distinct. They're very comprehensive in terms of how they spent their money. And to me, it was really amazing and eye-opening to get a look at and a peek at these records that he kept financially. So we now know what the Bears paid in salary for people like Bronco Nagurski, some of their big stars, and how little they paid a lot of the players. We find out that perhaps George Halas wasn't always honest in his appraisal of their financial situation. But it was pretty much, they always had a guarantee. Every contract would, and taking a step back, the contract would give a team an offer of, say, $1,200 or 40%, say, of the gate, of the net gate after rent was paid for the stadium. So it gave the team who was coming into Chicago kind of a choice. If they're going to play the Bears, they would probably take a percentage of the gate. If they're playing Cardinals, they would maybe just take the guarantee, knowing the gate wouldn't be that good. So I don't think the NFL, and I could be wrong, we'll probably hear about it, was totally involved except for establishing more of a traditional contract for the teams. And Joe Carr, who was that very, very, very influential president of the league after Jim Thorpe served 1 year, he was the one who really brought it up to speed in terms of classing it up and getting rid of college players, having contracts between the teams, and trying to make it into a more professional league to compete somewhat with professional Major League Baseball and the way things were scheduled and the World Series, et cetera, and how funding was divided. So that was one of the things. But the Sterneman records are just fantastic in terms of allowing us to get finally a look into the finances of the early years of the National Football League.
And so the old joke about Halas throwing around nickels like manhole covers, there was a reason for it. They were operating on the edges. They were, that's still one of my favorite. And I've heard other people eat, so apparently it's a term used everywhere. But that is one of the more famous quotes about George Halas. In terms of profession, and I was listening to your podcast this morning, your last one where you talked about the College All-Star Game. And I was thinking, and I was sitting there as I was listening, I go, why was professional baseball so socially accepted, but professional football was not? Where did that stem from? Because it was okay, obviously professional baseball, especially in Chicago, has been around since right after the Civil War.
Yeah, yeah.
But yet professional football was looked down upon. And yet, throw the next thing is, but college coaches, football coaches, were getting paid a ton back then.
Mhm.
Where did that kind of stem from? Help me try to understand that.
Yeah, that's a great, great question. I'll give you my opinion. For something, when pro football started, it was looked down upon as a dirty, nasty game that was run by criminals and thugs just trying to take advantage, as I mentioned in my podcast, of these poor players. And it was thought that the college football players, unlike baseball players, had a college education when it was not so prevalent in our society. And so they were expected to get a good job as an accountant or a teacher, or perhaps move on and become a lawyer, or a doctor, and never, ever, ever play football. And so that was one big thing. But then you'd have coaches come out against, like Stagg, as we've talked about, from the University of Chicago, very, very influential. And I think it was 1921 or 23. He came out with kind of an editorial that he released nationwide over the wire service, talking about how horrible pro football was. And then if you go to one of their Sunday games, you're committing to supporting this horrible, horrible entity that's going to crush college football and all the joy and all the spirit of it. And so it got picked up. And it was for years and years that people like Stagg would keep pounding away at pro football. His players, it was said, were so afraid of him that they would disguise themselves. And if they were going to play a pro football game under different names, but there's a famous story I mentioned in my first book about, there was a redheaded guy from the University of Chicago who put oil or something on his hair, disguised himself, and messed his face up with oil, and forgot it was a September game, very hot, and pretty soon the oil's running down his face, and they were figuring out that this guy really wasn't who he was. But even if you won a letter at, say, the University of Chicago, if Stagg found out you played pro football, he detested it so much he would take your letter away, even if you're 10 years out of school. And so other coaches felt the same way. There's a guy named Hanley, Coach Hanley in Northwestern, who agreed with Stagg and just thought this pro football nemesis was horrible and it should be done away with. So my opinion is that the colleges were so afraid of the competition, which they need, and the crowds, it took, as I said earlier, about 40 years to even start matching what the colleges were drawing. I think it was a financial fear. Not so much of anything else, but they would keep up this diatribe against pro football. And of course, we had a couple of hiccups along the way. One was the famous Taylorville, Carlinville game in Illinois, where guys from Notre Dame and Illinois played under assumed names, representing town teams, and they got caught. And the Packers, a lot of people don't know, were kicked out of the league at the first year they joined in 22 because they were using a college guy under an assumed name. They let the Packers back in the next year. And then in 25, it was a big scandal when Red Grange came from the University of Illinois. His team had completed their schedule. George Hellis interpreted the fact that he would be eligible to play pro football, so we signed him the day after. And Chris Willis, who you had on a couple of weeks ago, did a phenomenal book on Red, which goes deeper, that said, some of these negotiations were going on well before he was actually signed by the Bears. But that was more ammunition for the college folks to say, oh man, these guys are picking away the cream of the crop, and they should have let Red Grange graduate with his class. And that's, again, another example of how horrible football is. And then the worst thing that could have happened was in 1925 when the Milwaukee Badgers played the Chicago Cardinals in Chicago, came to town with not enough players, and recruited 4 high school guys from Englewood High School. And when that got out, pro football was looking horrible and more horrible all the time. So I think that's a lot to do with it. Baseball, you weren't expected to go to college. Anybody could play who was good enough. It seemed to be the American way. It started after the Civil War, where football was this newcomer using college players, taking advantage of them for their own grubby deeds and trying to line their pockets with finances. My opinion, it was finances, and the colleges were going to do all they could to push back against the threat of pro football back there in the 20s and 30s.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that because, now the whole mantra is, college players getting to the next level. And then in that era, the level should have been college, even if tried to go beyond that.
Yes, exactly.
It makes you wonder what guys like Stagg and Zepke, back then would think of where college football is at now.
Oh, wouldn't that be amazing? Yeah.
Which in essence, I mean, college football players are going pro before leaving college and still playing college ball. And
Yes.
it's a brand new world. It's interesting just how far we have come in terms of what, back then, even too, the Olympics was all amateur. Now, we're watching the Olympics this week. I just got done listening to the Japanese beat the US, and it's all pro players.
Yeah.
So it's very how things have come so full circle in a century.
It is amazing. You mentioned the Olympics, and I'm always looking like, wait a minute, how can that person be playing for France? I know they're from a U.S. college, and there's a big sports collector show in Chicago this weekend, and it was the first time they had college players selling their autographs, $150 a pop for the Oklahoma quarterback. Perfectly legal.
Where did I miss this? I did not see this in the news.
Yeah.
Was this out at Rosemont?
Yep, the one in Rosemont. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's probably a good thing my wife I didn't know about it because I would have asked my wife to go and she'd be like, yeah, no, I don't think so.
That's one of our usual stops. We didn't make it because we had some family commitments, but I kept starting to nudge towards the car to get up there. But next time we'll get there. I just love strolling through the aisle and say, whoa, there's a picture from 1916 of Harvard playing Yale in football. So neat stuff.
Oh, yeah. And I can imagine memorabilia. I'm kind of limiting what I buy now because it's just, you see it like, oh, wow, really, especially programs. I'm a sucker for programs. Yeah. And so, talking about, so we were, I started off my original question as to why Chicago is really, to me, the epicenter of the professional football world. So you've got two teams in town. So you got the Bears and you got the Cardinals. Now, everybody nowadays thinks of, when they think of Thanksgiving, they think of the Lions game and they think of the Cowboys. But back then, it was the Bears and the Cardinals.
It was. In fact, they started a streak in the mid-20s of playing on Thanksgiving Day. And it was kind of nuts because they didn't take the next week off. They would play again on Sunday. So they would probably play on Sunday, Thursday, Sunday. And going back to their rivalry, there was always disagreements on who would host it, when they would host it, because schedules were still put together in the 20s on the run. But yeah, they would get together. And one of the best examples in 1923, when the Bears and Cardinals together, and Greg, you've heard this story before, but Patty Driscoll, the star player of the Cardinals, was running around end, and George Halas and Joey Sterneman, the brother of Dutch, not only tackled Driscoll, but upended him and tossed him head first to the ground, knocking him out. And Driscoll kind of woke up and shook himself out of a daze and started swinging. He landed one on Joey Sterneman, who was 5'6", and Patty was only 5'9", but so much bigger guy. And he knocked Joey Sterneman out. Pretty soon, players from both teams were involved in the fracas on the field. Then the fans started coming out. And there was a great quote from Ed Healy, who the week before had become the first free agent in NFL history, saying something like, oh my gosh, I'm standing there. I just signed for $100 a game and I'm about to lose my life. Here comes that Al Capone crowd with guns on their hips. And sure enough, Halas, there was one story that Halas said he woke up from being knocked out and some guy was straddling him with a pistol to his head. Now, as the police were called, the horses came on the field and they broke it up. And the best part of that story was, in his autobiography, Halas said, yes, we lost 6-0, but everyone had a good time. And that's kind of what started some of these games with the Bears and Cardinals and their intense rivalry and all sorts of good stories there. And that's why I decided kind of to write a book about it, which is the next one coming out. So many fun things about how the two teams together, and we had fun-loving fans who would set fire to the bleachers if they weren't warm enough. snowballs and icicles being thrown at the players on the opposite team. So all good fun in Chicago back in those days. But that really was the start of the Thanksgiving rivalry. Before, as you said, the Lions or the Cowboys got involved later.
Yeah. Well, I always look forward to every year when the Packers and the Bears play. There's always that graphic on TV, the oldest rivalry in the NFL. And usually about 5 seconds after that pops up, there's a post or a tweet from a Facebook post or a tweet from you going, well, just I can hear the, and I'm the same way too, because it's we both know the history of, and the Bears Packers rivalry is truly the most intense one. And I always joke with people, Packer fans are my best friends, but man, come game time, the Bears and Packers, yes, I am a Cardinals fan, but I'm also a homer too. So when the Bears are playing, it's like, Bears have not had much luck against the Packers. We all know that. But it's always fun to watch it, especially when the Bears are winning, just to watch the Packers side kind of lose it. But going back to, the Bears and Cardinals, and again, you're going to be writing a book on, I can't wait to read it, but have had some great games over the years. During those years when the Cardinals were just horrible, they were always up for that Bears game.
They were a good example, and it goes on both sides, it seems. I'm going to give an example of 1935. The Cardinals were tied with the Lions. All they had to do was beat the Bears in the last game to win the Western Division. Of course, the Bears beat them. The Cards would return the favor throughout the years. In the early 50s, there was a huge upset when the Cardinals, I think, only won 1 or 2 games, played the Bears, and just blasted them. So there was all that rivalry, no matter who was doing what. But yeah, I agree too that the Bears and Packers rivalry is really intense. Of course, once the Cardinals left, they didn't play 2 or 3 times a year, or even once that often. They're going to play again this year, December 5th. So I'm looking forward to that one.
Are they playing here or are they playing there?
I believe they're in Chicago. Yeah.
Oh, that's December 5th though. I don't know. I might be more comfortable watching it on my TV.
Yeah, it might be too warm for you. You like a little colder.
That's kind of cool that you still, for people who still follow the teams after they move. The weird thing with me is I grew up a Jets fan. I was a big NFL fan. And in the NFL, I like the LA Rams. But then when the Rams moved, it's like, they're not the Rams anymore. I don't care about the St. Louis Rams. But then when they finally returned to Los Angeles, I started following them again. So I'm kind of a fair weather kind of person when it comes to that. But for you guys to continue to carry the for a team that's in Arizona now, that's pretty cool.
Joe, I don't know, maybe you've heard me say this before, but for years I had a second job, one week in a month out in Arizona, and I always refer to the Phoenix area and actually the whole state of Arizona as the far, far, far western suburbs of Chicago, because you go out there. And, I would say, probably about a good quarter of the people are out there are either from Chicago or their parents are from Chicago.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is very much, Portillo's is, and you go to, Joe, you've been in Arizona. Oh yeah, Portillo's. It's like, now the one thing you can't get in Arizona is a good Chicago style pizza, but that's a whole nother issue.
Right. Yes. That's a sensitive topic when people say, you want to get pizza? I said, nah.
Well, our pizza is more like a casserole, but it serves the purpose too. How long you got to wait for it? An hour? Yeah, I'll wait an hour for a pizza. But that's, pizza and football, the two things that Chicago is, baseball too, but when it comes to, so with the Cardinals, let's talk about how the championship years of the Cardinals. Now, there's only been there's been 25, but 25 is kind of a controversial year,
right? Yeah,
because of how that championship was awarded. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, 25 is probably the most controversial year in the NFL. And that's, we talked about earlier, the high school players playing for Milwaukee. And back then, the league had no set schedule, but it had an ending date. And that year of 25, it was December 20th. So the Cardinals were neck and neck with the Pottsville Maroons, two good teams. This story is complicated. There's arguments on both sides, and I understand that. The Cardinals played Pottsville and lost, but it was mistakenly billed as the World's Championship, even though it wasn't. They didn't have a playoff at that date. It was just another game. And so that was, I think, early December. Teams could still play for 3 more weeks. So, as is common, the Cardinals, as did 9 other teams, continued scheduling games after the 1st of December. Cardinals scheduled games against Hammond, who they had lost to earlier in the year, and against Milwaukee. And they won both quite easily. And a controversy came out then about the high school players that the Cardinals game against Milwaukee then should be taken off the schedule, which it never was. It probably should have been. But that allowed them to take a half game lead or so on Pottsville. Pottsville also then scheduled another game against the Notre Dame All-Stars. It would be bringing back the Four Horsemen from the 1924 season to play Pottsville in 1925. And the NFL commissioner had told Pottsville that they can't play that game, but Pottsville had talked to someone in the league office who I believe was not really a member of the staff, who apparently gave the head for that. And then it went back and forth to say who gave permission and who did not. But anyway, in the long run, at the league meeting in February of 26, Pottsville had already been removed from the league. Therefore, they're not eligible for the championship. Cardinals still had that half game lead because they never got rid of the Milwaukee game from the standings. So controversy continued because Chris O'Brien, the owner of the Cardinals, refused the title when it was awarded him by vote of the owners of the National Football League. And that's how the league was decided with no playoff. They would vote as to who was the champion. Sometimes there was a controversy whether games were legal or not. So the league was really in need of a firm schedule and a playoff system, which did evolve later in the early 30s. So that was a controversy that the Cardinals were awarded the championship. Pottsville was removed from the league. Then, like the Packers were a couple of years earlier, they were reinstated the next year when Grange and C.C. Pyle, his manager, started the new football league in competition. And so the NFL wanted as many of their former teams in there as well, including Pottsville. So that's kind of how it went. Still controversial. People think one team or the other won it, but the Cardinals are recognized as the champion by league vote in February of 1926.
And so, Scott, I'm sorry.
No, I was fine. I was just making a weird noise. Go ahead.
Oh, well, don't mind the noise. We got landscaping here. This is one of those, it's the Monday where all the landscapers descend on the neighborhood and cut all the grass. So that's what you're hearing in the background. I apologize. But, talking about systems. So the league had developed, and so Burt Bell back in the 30s came up with the idea of the draft. So the next time around, the next championship for the Cardinals was in that 47-48, where they had some good teams. And so that team was developed through the draft, correct? In terms of
it was, yeah.
And so tell us about those years, because those are kind of what I always term the lost Chicago football years, because Chicago had championship play. It just wasn't on the north side. It was on the south side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Bears had some great title-winning teams with Sid Luckman in the early 40s. Of course, the war broke everything apart, and most of the Cardinals roster went away. In fact, in 1943, you've heard this story that Pittsburgh and Philadelphia merged to form the Steagles. And then before, the Bears and the Cardinals wanted to get together, and the league said it would be too powerful a squad. So the Cardinals merged with Pittsburgh. And the old story, they were called the Card Pits, but they were so horrible, they were like a piece of carpet that everyone walked over. So that's when they were called the Carpets. But that led us then, the draft still continued, and players would come out of college. For example, Charlie Trippi was drafted during the war years, I believe, even though he wasn't with the team till 47. He went back to college. Other players like Elmer Angsman and Pat Harder were joining guys who had been with the team, and then players who had seen action in the war that came back. but it went from the Cardinals going on a streak from 1936 to 1945 without having a winning season to ending up 6-5 in 1945. And they got a little better the next in the 1947. They were 9-3 and won the title. So they were overloaded with talent. They had, as we mentioned, not only the draft choices coming in, such as Charlie Trippi, but the veterans returning, plus the guys who had stayed with the team who maybe didn't qualify for service or had come back from service early. So it was a powerful team, but a lot of the teams in the NFL were really strong at that time. And the Cardinals won in 47. And then in 48, which in my opinion was the best Cardinals team in history, they were 11-1. Played the championship game against the Eagles in Philadelphia in a blinding snowstorm or blizzard. There's some great things on YouTube that show some of the circumstances. And that's one of the things we'll never see again in football history. The field was covered with snow, and players from both teams helped not only shovel off the field by hand, but get together and remove the tarp. So can you imagine some of the players today being asked to move the tarp? No, I don't think you'll see it. But unfortunately, the Eagles won 7-0 after a Cardinals fumbled deep in their own territory late in the game. And that 1947 championship then is the last for the Cardinals. And in all of professional sports, no team has gone longer without a championship except those poor Cardinals. So next year it'll be 75 years unless they somehow break that streak this year and win the Super Bowl.
Well, I don't know. It's. I think the Cardinals this coming season, or if the Cardinals can't make it to the show this year with the lineup, the talent they have assembled on the field down there, I don't know. I don't know when they're going to do it, because I'm looking at the upcoming season and looking up at the lineup, going, yeah, I don't see how they can lose. But knowing the Cardinals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see a lot of the experts are picking them to go 8-8, but we always hold hope that this is going to be the year.
And, they're always, and it goes back to that rivalry with the Bears. I mean, the most famous game, I think the Bears, at least in the modern era, was the Monday night game between the Bears and the Cardinals, and Denny Green lost it after the game. And that's still a great clip in terms of, it just kind of said everything just about the frustration of the franchise. And again, I love, you and I are both hardcore Cardinals fans. We love the underdog, but being a Cardinals fan is much like being a Cubs fan too, because you have that, well, for instance, what the Cubs went through this past week, pretty much ditching the whole entire team. Like, oh, we're back to the Cubs the way things used to be. This is, we don't want to get used to winning. No, So after the Cardinals won, the championship, then we move on. Then it's kind of in a way, at least when, after reading your book, and the great thing about reading a history book is, how things end. Mm-hmm. However, you don't know the why until you read the history book. So from 48 to 59, what happened in terms of why was there such a decline in the team, do you think? I know obviously Bidwell had died. Mm-hmm. So was it an ownership? Was it what was it? What do you think?
I was lucky enough to interview a lot of the players while they were still around for that book, which is came out shortly before the Battle of the Alamo. That's how long it's been around. But they would always point to Walter Wolfner, who was the husband of Violet Bidwell after Charles died. And again, as I said earlier, not a football man. And he made a lot of the decisions that were really hurtful to the team in terms of player negotiations and upsetting the players. Players said that Bidwell had treated them so well, and now they were still taking buses when other teams were flying, and not completely honest. My book, when it came out, Pat Summerall did the introduction, which was fantastic. But little known story I share once in a while is that his first draft was very derogatory and had nothing to do with the book or about the book. It was about the Cardinals, because he was upset that he had asked, was he going to be traded? And he was told by Wolfner, no, you're our guy. We need you. And so he bought a house. That was a big deal in the 50s. And then like a week later, he was traded. And he's had that short fuse burning all those years. And so the publisher had to ask him if he maybe just write something different about the team history and not about his own personal feelings. So I think a lot of the bad non-football men were involved with that. If I'm might be mistaken, but I believe the Cardinals in the 1950s were the worst decade ever in terms of win-loss percentage for an NFL team in history. And they didn't seem to do well either on drafting people. No one player said that their drafting was done by reading magazines. And so they would read and see who might be one of the top players and then draft them. They weren't able to offer a lot of money because their attendance was very low and just didn't have the finances. So I think it was a combination of a non-football person being involved in football decisions, a lack of money, and then just going through all sorts of coaches during that decade. And as we know, Curly Lambeau was brought in after the Packers and he had a disagreement. He came down from Green Bay and he only lasted less than 2 years. And it was said that he didn't really have that much interest. He wasn't showing up for practices, etc. But they went through a lot of coaches. Coaches were real frustrated, didn't have the resources, I guess. And so that led to the Cardinals declining attendance and ultimately their move in March of 1960.
And then there was also, I mean, they had talent. They had Ollie Matson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then there was that trade. And that trade was probably one of the worst trade. You would think for the amount of players involved, it would have benefited the Cardinals.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it didn't. Tell people about the trade.
Yeah, the trade was a little bit of a surprise and was engineered by Pete Rozelle, who was working with the Rams at the time before he became the NFL commissioner, and managed to pry Ollie Matson loose, who was one of the leading rushers, receivers in the National Football League, a silver medalist at the 1952 Helsinki Olympic Games, well loved in Chicago, and traded for, I believe, 9 players, none of which ever made an impact with the Cardinals. And when you think, you talked about the Chicago Cubs trades last week, and a lot of people are saying, well, who'd they get for Bryant? Who'd they get for Rizzo? And you think, oh, they're 19-year-old rookies or they're untested. And so I think the Cardinal fans are looking at that list and saying, what do we get for these guys? Well, there's supposedly a couple of starters there, but they never really panned out for the Cardinals. So yeah, there was we're some talent there with the team throughout the 50s, but not enough talent. And then when they turned around and had that fire sale of Ollie Matson, and I think that really affected, again, attendance and their fan base, because the product putting on the field didn't seem like they were investing enough in the team, and to let a talent like that go. And at first you think, whoa, 9 players, they can rebuild the team and be a contender. Just didn't work out. And I think because they didn't do their homework on who they were actually getting. They almost said, well, the Rams, Pete Rozelle said, well, here, take these guys. We know they're not going anywhere. We'll buckle up this trade to get Ollie Matson. And there really wasn't anyone there that really helped them out very much in the future.
And so that was kind of that was kind of sort of really, in a way, as I read your book and knowing the history that I know, it seemed like that was kind of the beginning of the end of the Bears in Chicago. Do you, in terms, I mean, they left in 59, but like you said, that was the lost decade. And if the Cardinals were to stay in Chicago, if the Cardinals would have had a much better record, do you think, and this again, just asking for an opinion, do you think they might have stayed in Chicago?
Yeah, better record probably would have meant bigger crowds, and the television era was starting to kick off with that famous 58 game playoff game. Called one of the best games in history with the Colts. And maybe if they were competitive, fans would have gone. Maybe they might have gone to Soldier Field permanently and started filling that place up. I do believe Chicago is a big enough place that can support, well, I think baseball does that now, support two professional teams in football.
We do, and it's been surprising this year to see actually people. Let's face it, Chicago has always been a Cubs town. But when the White Sox are winning, it's nice to see people in the stands down on the South Side, because it's just so for whatever reason, the South Side has always been a harder draw than, say, the North Side. And obviously, I think you and I both know a lot of that has to do with the stadium, not the teams.
Yes.
The state, I mean, Wrigley Field it's an amazing place. For those who are listening, have never been to Wrigley Field. If you ever come to Chicago, it's really right up there on tops of, places to see. And really the best. Joe, have you ever been to Wrigley? on an off day?
Yes, years ago though. Yes.
I did. Okay, so after the Cubs won the World Series,
Mm.
my bucket list thing was, okay, I need to get up and get a tour of Wrigley Field. And so my wife and I, April, perfect. And it felt like a fall day. It really felt it was a football day. Got the grand tour of Wrigley Field and went all over. And it was really cool because not only did you get to go on the field and sit in the dugout and visit, I always say the ghost of sports live at Wrigley Field. Because if you look at our history, American sports history, Wrigley Field plays a major part in American sports history, both not only baseball, but football. And
Right, yeah.
and so when we did that tour, went into the visitors locker room, the same visitors locker room that had been used ever since the visitors locker room had been built. And I sat there with my wife and just kind of sitting down. I'm listening to them talk, and my wife's like, "What's wrong?" I go, "I can hear ghosts." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" I go, "I can hear Unitas. I can hear Lombardi." Just that feeling that you are in the presence of literally greatness of all the
Yes.
people that have come through there. And it's an amazing experience to, to sit in a stadium that is still around, that's over 100 years old, that played such a key role in the growth of professional football in this country.
Mhm.
And so, and I'm sorry, I'm digressing here.
We love
I'm
it.
going down memory lane here. But so the Cardinals were at the 1950s, and so they went to Soldier Field. Was Soldier Field? Why did they go to Soldier Field in that last year?
That's a great question. And I'm trying to figure that out myself because Soldier Field was really, I'm going to use a bad word. It was a dump then. It was really falling apart. It wasn't used that much. It was used for the Pan Am games
Right.
Around that time, I believe. But for football, it was tough. It was still that big horseshoe, as we talked about earlier, still held well over 100,000 people. But part of the contract that I saw, and again, we look at the Washington Library and some of the resources, I found a contract, the Cardinals, that the city of Chicago would agree to, or the Park District would agree to make certain changes in the field to make it more hospitable, if I said that word correctly, for football in the 1959. I always sensed that there was a little bit of not hostility between Comiskey Park and the Cardinals. Of course, in '59, the White Sox went to the World Series as well.
I forgot about
so
that. Yeah.
There may have been that the Sox didn't want to risk anything by having the Cardinals come in there. They had done that earlier, and it was like 1926 or 24, I forget, where they said the Cardinals couldn't use the stadium. Okay. And of course, and then 1926, the new league with Joey Sterneman had a team called the Chicago Bulls, believe it or not, that played and took Comiskey Park. But my just feeling is that maybe the Cardinals got a little better deal, being that they were up for cash in 1959 to go to Soldier Field, and hopefully that the changes that the Park District was going to make would be fulfilled. But after they left, I think the Park District tried to nail the Cardinals for costs that they had been promised that weren't paid. I'd have to look into that. And that wasn't too hard to believe either. We talk about George Chess being tight. In my second book about Morgan Park Military Academy, I found out what the Cardinals had a nice contract there to do their preseason training.
Right. And, I meant to mention that earlier in the show. I mean, Morgan Park was, they did for years. They trained there.
They were there, and they paid $2.50 per person per day for room, board, practice facilities. Cardinals forgot to pay the bill and they left. Oh my gosh. So it wasn't just George Ellis.
And during that last season, the Cardinals played not only home games at Soldier Field, but they were also playing home games elsewhere, specifically Minneapolis. And it was that them just trying to figure out if they were going to move to Minneapolis, because this is right when the AFL was starting to form. Was this just a way to get more money from the gate?
Yeah. And case, I think it was financial. They played 2 games in Minneapolis, both drew over 20,000, which was good for the Cardinals, and don't have the contract, but it sounded like it was a pretty sweet deal that they would go up there and like they had done for some other exhibition games, and they would get a majority of the gate right off the top. So it would make it worthwhile financially for them to go to Minneapolis, and also could check out, and who knows, maybe they were looking at that as a possible destination for moving the franchise.
Right. Well, and speaking of destinations, now people that are listening to this, and a lot of our listeners are in Canada. So a lot of them are playing. Okay, why are they talking about Chicago football, your Canadian football podcast? So explain, let people know here, and there are people who know, but there are a lot of people who don't know why the Chicago Cardinals factor into a little CFL history. If you could go, I'll cede the floor to you to lay out that history and for everybody who's listening north of the border.
Yeah, let me give you a couple of fun stories. One would be 1953. Cardinals signed a halfback from Syracuse called Avitus Stone. Great running back, also a good punter. And so he reported to training camp. He had gotten a $200 bonus, believe it or not. And then a couple of days later, he asked for an advance of $500, which the Cardinals were glad to give to him. This is a promising young player. And then he disappeared. No one knew where he was. They tried to track him down to his wife. And his wife said, "Oh, he's in Canada." What? Apparently he had signed with Toronto. But when his flight went to Toronto, he kept going and he left. And I believe he went to Ottawa. So he skipped out on his contract with the Cardinals and with his promises to Toronto, and went with Ottawa. And he left Chicago, where he was missing on August 17th of 1953. And on August 19th, he was in the lineup, and Ottawa lost a game, but he was in the lineup. They lost 12-9 to Edmonton. And a fun part of that, when I was looking up that game, that it was 70 degrees, and the newspaper called it sweltering. So that's the sweltering 70-degree heat. Now, those of you from Alabama might not agree with that description.
Oh, man, 70 degrees would be heaven.
So he had signed with the Cardinals in July. He was in the Canadian League by August. He played there for several years. He was an all-star in 53 and 55, and he won the Jeff Ruge, if I'm pronouncing that right, Russell Memorial Trophy as the best player in the Eastern Division in 1955. So he was the best player in that league. So Toronto thought they had him. He went to Ottawa. In fact, there was some controversy there because his mother claimed she received money from a Canadian team that was not named to influence him to go up to play in Canada. So the Cardinals immediately threatened to sue both him and the whole Canadian Football League because of this contract problem, that he accepted their money under false pretenses, but nothing really ever came of it. He enjoyed a nice career. He came back to the National Football League for one game in 1958 as a punter for the Colts. So he enjoyed a 4 or 5 year career in Canada before he injured his knee and had to leave football. And he went on and lived until the year 2000. So he was one of the greats from Syracuse, and then, of course, was able to play in the Canadian League. So I think we made a nice tie in there. But I think the better story is in 1959, August 5th, the Cardinals decided to play Toronto in an exhibition game. And this was a fun one because teams had tried to play before and had not been able to agree on the rules. And in this game, they decided that if the Cardinals had the ball, there would be 11 men on the field on both sides. And if Toronto had the ball, there would be 12 men on the field on both sides. But the Cardinals, even before that, had traded one of their players, a guy named Jim Taylor, to the Hamilton Tigers the day before that game started. So there was some connection between the teams. And I noticed in doing some research for this game that there was a lot of anticipation, not only in the rules, but perhaps the big crowd that would come out. They anticipated it would be the biggest crowd ever to see a football game in Canada. And some of the rules that were played would allow unlimited blocking, which was different in Canada at the time. And of course, I mentioned the different types of numbers on the field, be 12 or 11. And Toronto's coach was a guy named Hampool, who played for the Bears in the early 40s, had a nice career for 3 or 4 years. A little bit of an eccentric guy. It seemed like wherever he coached after that, he would have difficulties with either the player, the other members of the coaching staff. So I won't get into anything with his descendants, but he was let go from a couple of teams he coached with. He had a really successful career coaching in the NFL, but when he heard about the blocking rules, he was all for using the U.S. rules for that. In fact, said football is blocking and tackling, and any rule that prevents a player from doing it by fair means is a rule which is not in the best interest of the game, he said. So that was Hampool giving a little bit of a speculation before the game, and they were hoping that there would be a big gate, and the Toronto general manager, we're expecting, a guy named Lou Heyman said, we're expecting 25,000 or better if they get a good break in the weather. But this would be the first game by an NFL team up in Canada to play in nearly 10 years, and the first game ever in Toronto featuring an NFL team. But the teams did set a record for attendance. The Cardinals won 55-26, but what was the surprise was that the Cardinals fell behind the first quarter 13-1. And a quarterback named Ronnie Knox, who was supposedly on loan from the Bears, was just tearing the Cardinals apart. He was passing mad, had a great passing day. I think he was 23 of 26. But the overwhelming size of the Cardinals eventually took over, and they won fairly easy. Knox completed 19 of 23 passes, for 219 yards. But the crowd was what was the big story. Almost 28,000 people showed up. And that was, of course, the biggest crowd to date to see a football game in Eastern Canada, and the greatest turnout for any preseason game in the history of the league. So the Cardinals won that game. A former Cardinal named Dave Mann, to continue our correlation between the two teams, he scored two of the touchdowns for Toronto. Of course, there was some criticism thereafter. One was traffic before the game. Said it took people, they were getting out of the cars. It sounded like Woodstock in 1969. They were getting out of their cars and walking the last mile to get to the game. They didn't get there till halftime because of the huge crowd. But the big thing was everybody made money. With 27,700 fans, the gate was $118,000. And the Toronto team paid 15% of the gate for rental to the Canadian National Exhibition, which is about 18,000. They paid expenses to the Cardinals for traveling and promotion, and that left 90,000 to be split between the two clubs. So the Cardinals were happy. They walked away with at least $45,000, and the only ones who were unhappy were those who had to walk a little bit to get to the game. Some interesting side notes was Cookie Gilchrist was playing for Toronto that day at linebacker, and the Windsor paper, I believe, said something that Cookie was outclassed in the Chicago Cardinal game, but has greater ability than he has so far displayed for the Argonauts. Of course, he became a quite a big name for himself in the NFL. So that was the big thing. We talked about quarterback Ronnie Knox, one of my favorite stories in all of football. He was a guy who went to 3 high schools because he couldn't find a coach he liked. He went to 2 colleges because he couldn't find a coach he liked. He left college kind of early. He was drafted by the Bears, didn't show up for practice or for meetings, so Hellas supposedly loaned him, actually fined him and dumped him. But in 1958 for Ottawa, he passed for 522 yards. And if I'm not mistaken, that's still the second most ever passing yardage that a quarterback has had in the Canadian Football League. But the next year, in 1959, about a month after his great game against the Bears, he left football. He was getting paid $1,250 a game, but he said he didn't like football anymore. He was going to become a poet, and he moved to Europe. So what a great story, Ronnie Knox. And therefore, I'll quit boring you about this game, but I was really excited to talk about it, that opportunity.
Hey, I want to get a book of Ronnie
that's
Knox poetry now.
yeah. And then also too, real quickly, just following on that, did the Bears and the Alouettes play that same year?
I think they did play that year. Yeah. And they played
Yeah.
a couple of seasons.
And
then-
yeah, no, it's, when we had all this XFL talk going on for the last 4 months, and I know everybody's Twitter feed is different, so I imagine yours is much different than ours. But when you had all it's interesting, and this is where I always say history matters. And during the time period between the XFL talks to the time it ended, there was all kinds of discussion as to, well, you can't make, the CFL plays by different rules in this. And I'm like, well, there is a template. There is a starting point to figure this all out. Again, and then it's talking about when the NFL went to Canada for those exhibition games to kind of to play. And, and so I always tell people, go back, especially on the American side, saying, hey, go back, read the history of those games. The game in Toronto is a good example. I did not realize that was at the time, the largest crowd to see a Canadian game.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so history always, I love, we all love football history, sports history, and especially football history. And as the CFL, they're facing a lot of challenges, as you well know.
Sure.
But the history of the game, the history of, God, how many is it? It's over 60 years now, still is applicable to a lot of things today.
Yes.
And so do you think now obviously the Cardinals, the NFL is so much bigger nowadays that it's morphed and everything. But and Scott, help me out here. I mean, you and I have had this discussion. The CFL is very reminiscent of the way football used to be in the United States.
Yeah, for me, when I watch it, I mean, even obviously it's a modern game being played, 2021, but it's still, yeah, it is. I mean, it's still just kind of old school. I mean, I think a lot of it just goes back to how players seem to relate to the fans, that they seem to be really a part of the community. And frankly, maybe it's even because of the smaller crowds. It just seems a little more intimate,
Right.
But
well, and that's why I always, when I talk Chicago football, Joe, I always kind of wax poetically about that time period that you've written about with the Cardinals and the struggles that they had, because they're all, anybody who loves football needs to go back and read the history books to understand where we are at today.
Oh,
so
yes.
Yeah. So with that said, hey, can you let everybody know, A, how to find your books, B, where to find you on Twitter, where to find you on the social media? Because you've got a few places out there that are great resources online that our podcast we don't have.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead and tell. I'm sorry.
No, thank you very much. And again, for the opportunity to talk about the Cardinals. I hope I didn't babble on too much, but I get excited talking about football history. But a couple of places, the books are available on Amazon.com, of course, for both of the books. Although the book on the Cardinals, I must admit, is out of stock. There was a nice mention in Sports Illustrated a while ago, and that seemed to deplete the stock. We're hoping it'll get reprinted one day, but copies still available on Amazon. They are second generation copies, but the second book on Morgan Park Military Academy, those are brand new, spanking new copies, which are available.
And they're also, are they available on Kindle now too? I think
yes,
I saw
that's
the Morgan Park one too.
Morgan Park is not the car one, so the Morgan Park one's available on an electronic version, also through Amazon. So that would be there as well. And we do have a Chicago Cardinals Facebook page, and we've been lucky enough to have over 11,000 folks follow that. And to reach it, just look on Facebook, search for Chicago Cardinals, or more specifically, it's facebook.com/Chicago Cards/. And we also have a Twitter account, which covers mostly all Chicago football history. We do a little bit of Bears, Cardinals, high school, college. My Twitter account is Cards Chicago. So can reach us there.
And-
And of course, our podcast on the Sports History Network, and you gentlemen just do such a resoundingly wonderful job on your program.
Well, thank you.
We're on there with you, and we appreciate all you have done. And of course, you bring the professionalism too that I lack on mine. So I really appreciate being partnered with you guys.
Oh, I would debate that with you. I would
Oh,
definitely.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're terrific. I mean, this
Yeah.
really is, it's been like, it's like been sitting in a class and just learning from a history instructor that you actually like.
Right. Yeah. and Joe, since I got you and it's recording, I'm going to tell you straight out. I mean, you're part of the reason why we're doing this podcast, because when I first met you, I was just this lone guy sitting, hey, I love the Chicago Cardinals. Boom, your book came out, and I devoured that years before you and I met. And then there was that the meeting at, I forget which library it was. And unfortunately, I still feel horrible to this day that the library screwed up the time and average, because I was the only guy there, but I'm glad I was, because I got time to spend with you and your wife. And then, it was years. And then the next time we saw each other was at Oak Park. I had a good friend of mine from the Navy, and we listened to your, I mean, you've got great, when we're out of this pandemic, are you going to get back to hitting the lecture circuit?
Yeah, we'll do a couple this fall already, not doing a lot. We'll be in Northbrook, and I'm going to be posting those on the Chicago Cardinals Facebook page. There's another one. I should remember.
Northbrook's anyway. Kind of a haul for me, man.
Yeah. The other one is on the nearest north side. So I'll have to put those on. So
you doing Downers Grove or Oak Park or anything close? Oh, and the other, and the other thing too, I forgot to mention, was your Hall of Fame exhibit you did down at the Orland Park Library. Was it 2 years ago now?
2 years already. Yes. I can't believe that. Hard to believe. But yeah, we had a big exhibit on the Cardinals. We hope to do that again sometime.
I made a special trip down there to see it.
Oh, thank you for being there.
I'm like, my wife was like, what do you want to do today? I go, I want to go to Orland Park Library. For what? Because Joe's got stuff there. And my wife, who is obviously not a football fan, but was really, really impressed by everything. She was looking at it going, wow. Now my wife's Japanese. So, I mean, it's for her to see stuff like that. And I think it helped her understand my passion for football a little bit more. And, so I thank you for that, because, but you have, you're kind of my mentor when with the podcast, and it was with, when I reached out to Scott one day and I'm like, let's do a podcast. You are part of that reason for us doing what we're doing. And same with Arnie and same, I always give a shout out to the guys over in Tokyo who do a CFL podcast, because Scott and I have learned over in the last few months, and we've done a lot of podcasts, just how enjoyable it is talking football with friends.
It is a blast. And again, thank you for the opportunity. I should mention, I just remembered, mainly because I looked it up, I'll be at the North Shore Public Library on September 20th. That's a Monday for the next program that we'll be doing. But yeah, we hope to do more programs throughout the year. Then next year, pick it up. And so at the Lincolnwood Library in November 16th.
Okay. Or as we say in Chicago, the North Shore.
Yeah. Over there. It's we got a whole bunch of them, but it's been awesome to talk to you today. And for Scott and I and Joe, hey, thank you for listening to us in the Sports History Network. And if you haven't already, take a listen to Joe at When Football Was Football. It's on the same place you get all our podcasts. And Joe, you do 15-minute segments. I mean, you don't have the hour and a half show like we have, but you have specific, 15 to 20 minute lectures on different subjects. Like, I said earlier about the college all-star game. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What we try and do is do original research for each program. And so it's just me trying to put people to sleep with old football history, but trying to find something people may not know about. For example, we did one on Hugo Besdick, who was the only person to coach an NFL team as well as a Major League Baseball team. So little items that have popped
I've
up
not
over
listened
the
to
years.
that one.
Yeah, it's one of the original ones. And Mats Tonelli, the one from the NFL to Baton. back to the NFL. So little personalities there that probably always feel that it'd be great to talk to people about this and spend some time digging up some additional information. So yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
That program is on the Sports History Network, and it's called When Football Was Football.
And lastly, when's the book coming out?
I don't have a date yet.
Okay.
We do have a publisher. McFarland is going to be publishing it. And so I can't wait because there's so much new stuff. You know, when you get excited about history.
I'm excited just knowing. I didn't realize that you were writing the book. And I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah, this, yeah. Yeah. So, well, hey, thank you very much. And for everybody listening, we will be seeing you again real soon. And signing off for Scott, Joe, and I. Thank you very much. Like I said, thank you very much for listening, and hope to be back with you soon. Bye-bye.
Wild coaches, they had some wild players in those days. They had guys who kind of inept, and the best thing they could do is run as far as away from the defending lineman and throw the ball. And sometimes it took on a kind of a Charlie Chaplin-esque appearance out there.
In true slapstick fashion, the Chicago Cardinals of the 1950s walked a path laden with banana peels. Footballs were thrown like pies, and there were chases worthy of the Keystone Cops. Like slapstick movie characters, the Cardinals thrived on ridiculous situations that enabled them to display uncommon resourcefulness. From chaos, the Cardinals created high comedy, and it was high comedy created in a low-budget environment.
We didn't have very good equipment. The Cardinals at that time, the word class never came close to us. We rode the train to games, train to Cleveland, train to Green Bay, wherever we went. It was just it was not the big leagues.
We played at Comiskey Park in those days, which was the home of the White Sox, so they used to sod the infield. And we had scored a touchdown, so it was on the south end of the field, which was the sodded portion. And Billy Cross went in to hold for Joe Gary. Well, the ball was snapped. Joe goes through the motion, makes a kick, and ref throws his hand up in the air. The stands all yell, and what had happened is that Joe had actually kicked a piece of sod had gone over the goalpost. And Billy Cross, I'll never forget, I happened to be looking at Billy, and the look on his face, because there he is still holding the ball.
The team was usually left holding the bag during a decade in which they totaled a mere 33 wins. They boasted but one true superstar, halfback Ollie Matson, whose speed made him seem less a man than a force of nature.
I can remember hearing him go by. It was like the windstorm going by. And I never heard anything like that before. He was just so fast that he created a breeze when he went by.
Matson, number 33, was a rushing, receiving, and return threat, whose many talents would earn him a place in the Hall of Fame. The Cards got a lot out of Matson, and when they eventually traded him, they got a lot for him, or so it seemed.
The Cardinals traded Ollie Matson to the Los Angeles Rams for 11 ball players. Of the 11, 9 had to be classified as garbage. Absolute garbage. I think 6 or 7 of them never showed up because they were real dogs.
The Matson trade was one of several unusual personnel decisions.
We drafted a quarterback from Ohio State one year, number 1. And we said, oh, super, boy, we needed a quarterback badly. And I, being a receiver, thought I wish we'd get somebody to get the ball to me. And lo and behold, the fellow showed up and started throwing a ball, and he couldn't get the ball 15 yards down the field. And we found out the reason they drafted him because they liked his picture in the Street and Smith. He had nice legs and looked well proportioned and looked like a real football player.
But even if the team's quarterbacks weren't picture perfect, they did fit into an offense that somehow managed to move the ball forward without benefit of the forward pass. During the 1950s, sleight of hand was the Cardinals' trademark, and the tricks of their trade induced gasps of astonishment from an awestruck audience.
Although we didn't win many games, we were exciting to watch because really sometimes the players didn't know what was going to happen.
A lot of those plays really were not designed plays, needless to say. By looking at them, you could tell they weren't designed plays. I can remember the 5 head coaches that I played for in 5 years. And sometimes they just throw up their hands in disgust because of the way that some of those zany plays would turn out.
One head coach who devised creative methods of indicating his disgust was Joe Steidehar.
He had a very unique way of paying us. He'd bring in a fistful of brown envelopes which contained our paychecks. And he would have seen the game films, and he would write a little note on each player about his performance in the previous game, such things as, I always thought you had no guts, and now after watching the film, it's confirmed. And I remember once we had to play the Bears the last game of the season. And he came storming in the door of the dressing room, threw the checks across the dressing room. They scattered all over the floor. He told us to fight for our own checks. And he says, if you guys don't beat the Bears next week, I'm not paying any of you. I'm finding you a game salary. Well, that's the only game we won that year. We beat the Bears at Wrigley Field 24-10.
For a while, the Cardinals always seemed to cash in against the Bears. From 1950 to 1955, the Cards won 6 out of 9 meetings from their more successful neighbors from the North Side. This crosstown rivalry gave the Cardinals an opportunity to steal the thunder from the team that reigned supreme in the Windy City.
The media, we felt, was always tainted towards the north side, the Chicago Bears. We never had that on the south side. I can remember playing games in Comiskey Park in the 50s where there were 6,000 or 7,000, 9,000 people in the stands. Wrigley Field was always sold out.
But when the Bears went down to play the Cardinals in Comiskey Park, the place was packed. I mean, it turned into a riot every time. All the games I played against the Cardinals when I was with the Bears ended up in a fight.
But while the Cardinals often won the battles, the Bears ultimately won the war for territorial rights to the toddling town. In 1960, the Cardinals moved to St. Louis, signaling the end of a colorful era. During the 1950s, the Chicago Cardinals didn't produce many victories, but their offbeat and exciting style of play produced plenty of thrills and made them one of the most entertaining teams in NFL history.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday's Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.